Good afternoon, good morning, good night, whichever it is. This is Matt Barmas. I'm doing a speech today that I've titled Filling the Dyadic Gap. This is for my Understanding Human Communications class. As my introduction, what I'd like to say is when it comes to communication, communication is something that's very misunderstood. A lot of people avoid it like the plague. They either don't communicate, or if they do it very poorly. Very rarely do you find somebody who's a very good communicator. It's a subject in life that we tend to not focus much on, and I think it's a subject that deserves some attention. It's an area that every one of us deserve to make room for improvement in our lives. As a husband, it's good for me to learn to communicate better. As a wife, communication is key. In life, at work, friends, communication's crucial. But the focus today is on dyadic communication, which is it's a communication between a pair of individuals who share the same interests, romantic interest, family relationships, if I belong to a model train club, the relationship between me and the other people in the communication, that would be dyadic communication. Work partners. But the crucial thing about communication, before you can learn better communication, is first of all to know your own style of communication. Identify what kind of communication styles you have. Some don't have any at all. But in some way, shape, or form, we communicate. And to identify your own style of communication, first of all, is crucial. But along with identifying your style, it's important to identify maybe an area of weakness. As a husband, it's crucial to realize where my weaknesses are and how to communicate with my wife better. I know that I have some areas that could use some improvement. And then the last thing, as far as our introduction, is if you desire to have a better level of communication, that's to first of all make a choice to want to learn, and then make those changes. So first of all, what is dyadic communication? Like I said, it's a style of communication that involves interaction between pairs of individuals. It's the most common type of personal communication. Not all encounters are dyadic. If I'm walking down the street and I see somebody and I just have a chance communication with that person, that's not dyadic, because there's nothing personal being shared. We're not on the common ground as far as our wavelengths, as far as what we're talking about and what we're saying. That's the different style of communication. Where do you see dyadic communication? You see it in face-to-face communication. Media channels, Facebook, Instagram, those forms of social media, telephone conversations, email, text messaging, all those things are different venues that you can see dyadic communication. An example of a dyadic communication would be the discussion between Jesus and Peter. When, Jesus asked Peter, he says, who do they say I am? And Peter comes back and he says, hey, you are the Son of God. And this is a communication amongst two people on the same subject, the same interests. And so this is an example of dyadic communication. The thing is dyadic communication is not age specific. It's not something just for young people. It's not something for old people. It involves all ages. The older generations tend to have a harder time communicating with people of the younger generations. It's commonly heard, some old people refuse to accept the idea of the cell phone. They still don't see the necessity of it, but it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And because of the unknown, people tend to just move on and ignore like it doesn't exist. But the thing is communication does exist, and these different styles of communications do exist. Whether you agree with Facebook or not, it exists, and it's a profitable form of communication if handled correctly. You know, I remember the days before there was a cell phone. There's those in our generations that lived before there were cell phones or or social networking or any of this stuff, and they managed just fine. Now I'm of the generation. I remember when it didn't exist, and of course I guess I call myself the middle gap. I remember when we didn't have cell phones, but I remember how cool it was to get a pager, and I remember how cool it was to get a cell phone and to learn how to use a smartphone and try to bridge the gap between the older generation and the younger generation as far as social networking, and it's a continuous effort to keep up with the times when it comes to communication. Like I said, I remember when cell phones didn't exist. Well, how did we communicate then? We actually took time and we wrote letters. We mailed out letters. Post office was mailed out many letters from people communicating to each other. You'd pick up the phone, you would actually call somebody, or better yet, you would go by their house and you would just do a face-to-face call. Funniest thing I remember seeing is on Facebook at some point it was a picture of a house with a bunch of bicycles out in the yard. And the caption says, "This is my years of social networking." That was when you'd get in your bike, you'd ride down the street to your friend's house, and we social network together. Well, of course, today in this fast-paced society, Facebook, Instagram, it provides us the opportunity to communicate without leaving our home, or we can communicate while we're standing in line at the grocery store. And while it's a lot faster and easier mode of communication, it has its drawbacks. And the older generation people have a hard time communicating with the younger because of this gap. And so it's my desire in this speech to help people identify the fact that there is other modes of communication, and the need for them to get out of their comfort zone and learn new styles of communication. Is communication easily understood? No. It's a difficult thing. I mean, many marriages have struggled for years trying to figure out how to communicate just to the person you love. When it comes to communicating to people at work, you get people that are difficult to deal with. How do you handle talking to them versus somebody that you like to talk to? And our communication style is ever changing. It's ever challenged. It's something that needs to be continually worked at and identified and analyzed. And it's not something that you can just put yourself on a train track and just keep rolling. It's something that's got to be continually worked at and identified. So the idea of communication, in my opinion, being that I'm in the middle gap between the old and the young generation, I see that the older generations tend to have a more of a struggle in their ability to communicate. You can't really do any kind of business anymore without needing an email address. Everything is web-based, and for somebody who's up in age who lived in the days where this wasn't necessary, it's an overload for some people to identify with those styles of communication. It doesn't mean that doesn't exist. It just means that these forms of communication is foreign to them. And so it's a good thing for those that are in the older generations to maybe reach out their comfort zone to identify different ways of communicating. And grandfathers would love to be able to communicate better with their grandchildren, and sometimes it may mean them learning how to run Facebook or better yet, maybe Instagram or other things. But back in the old days, when everybody communicated through the telegraph, that was the big thing. And I can only imagine the hard times it was for those who went from the telegraph to the telephone. I'm sure back in those days there's people who didn't see the necessity for it, but of course now the telegraph is obsolete and it's not even used anymore. But at one point it was the only way to communicate. Like I said, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, emails, A lot of older people refuse to have it. I know guys that still do not have cell phones, and there's guys that I know who have a flip phone because they refuse to get a smartphone because it's too confusing for them. I think we as a middle generation and a young generation, I think we owe it to ourselves and to those that are over us to maybe help educate the older generation in these new forms of communication. Now, what dyadic communication is not is just sudden communication between strangers. That'd be an example of non-dyadic communication. You see this when, if you're in a grocery store and you strike up a conversation with somebody in the grocery store line, that's not a sharing of interest type conversation, and so it's not in dyadic there. Now, there's a spiritual dyadic side that I think is necessary. We as Christians, we owe it to ourselves and to the cause for Christ to better understand how to communicate to those that we wish to witness to. And when spreading the gospel of Christ, we owe it to ourselves to study other people's dyadic style. I mean, for me to go in and insist on people understanding my way without me willing to understand theirs, it's not an effective form of communication. Jesus, of course, demonstrates this because he's the ultimate communicator. I mean, it didn't matter who it was. He knew exactly what to say, and he knew how to get to the level of each person he spoke with. And I think as we identify communication and we think about it more in detail, we can realize that there's room for improvement in all of our ways. No matter how good a speaker we are, there's always room for improvement. But in conclusion, better communication comes with better understanding. The more we understand these different forms of communication, the better that we'll be able to communicate. Dr. Gary Chapman wrote a book called The 5 Love Languages, and the point in his whole book was for each of us to identify with these different love languages so that when, say, a husband and wife, the husband may be more interested in acts of service, and the wife may be the type of person who's affectionate. And, but we owe it to ourselves to identify the other people's kind of love languages, and that was Dr. Gary Chapman's point of view, was that we owe it to ourselves and to those that we communicate with to identify their communication style so that we can be more effective in our communication. In the military, in a lot of businesses, people who are bilingual or trilingual and maybe know 4 languages, they're highly sought after, and in the military, that's one of the big jobs. I got a friend of mine who's in the military, and he's learned Arabic, and of course, he has a crucial job. I mean, learning other forms of communication is crucial, and it's instrumental, and it's valuable. There's a gentleman named Brian Tracy. He quotes saying, "Communication is a skill that you can learn. It's like riding a bicycle or typing. If you're willing to work at it, you can rapidly improve the quality of every part of your life." I remember when I first learned to ride the bike, I don't remember anything but the continual struggle of falling down and getting back up, but eventually I worked at it and I got it. Number 2, I think knowledge is power. And the more you know, the better, the more power you have as far as your way of communicating. If you're a grandparent, learn to communicate your grandkids' style. Dare to do some Facebook. Dare to do an Instagram post. Twitter, I'm still learning that, but it's the way of the future. Number 1, we owe it to ourselves to learn. So I encourage those of you who struggle in their communication to maybe take some time and identify other ways of communicating and dare to explore. Thank you, and have a great day.